There was a man who was very wealthy and invited his 3 daughters one day and asked them how much they loved him. The first 2 answered with very poetic language, with very beautiful flowery terms. But the third, when her turn came, who was the youngest, said to her father, "I love you as much as salt loves food." The father was upset and banished her from the home and left all of his property to the 2 older girls. This girl went away, but because she was resilient, because she would never give up, she managed to live a life of her own and married a very wealthy person and became the mistress of a large estate. Many years passed, and the girl obviously had forgiven her father for his rash judgment and invited him one day for a meal. The father could not recognize his daughter and did not know who she was. He only was aware that she was very wealthy. The father went to this daughter's home, and the daughter did not reveal who she was. When the food was served, she had instructed the servants beforehand to prepare all the dishes without salt. The father sat at table and the dishes were served. And after having taken in the first course, the father realized that something was amiss and something was missing. And then the second course, and then the dessert, and then the coffee, and everything seemed tasteless to the father. The father didn't want to insult his host, but he called the host to him and said to her, "My dear, there was something missing in the food." And the girl said, "I'm so sorry. I have a feeling the servants did not put salt into the food." At that moment, the father realized what had happened. He looked intently at this hostess and recognized in her his daughter. And he said to her, "Many, many years ago, you said to me, 'I love you as much as salt loves food.' Now I understand that you love me more than the other 2. Will you forgive me?" And the girl forgave her father. Those with high blood pressure might not appreciate this story so much because all of your meals are possibly without salt. But we know when we have illnesses like this, what salt is. In the gospel text of today, Jesus uses 2 metaphors to identify who the disciples must be. And in the first, he says to them, "You are the salt of the earth." What does Jesus mean when he tells his disciples that they are the salt of the earth? Salt is known for being a preservative. Salt at the time of Jesus was also used to purify. Salt was used for cleaning vessels. Salt was used to offer sacrifice. Salt was used in food. Does Jesus talk about the function of salt? Does he talk about the external properties of salt, whether salt is white in color or brown in color or granular or powder? None of these is mentioned by Jesus. Then what does Jesus mean when he tells the disciples that they are the salt of the earth? Jesus talks about the intrinsic quality of salt. he talks about the distinctive quality of salt, and the intrinsic quality of salt is that salt is salty. To talk of unsalty salt is an absurdity, and that's why Jesus goes on to say that if salt loses its taste, if salt loses its saltiness, it is of no use to anyone whatever. So Jesus is not talking about the properties of salt or the qualities of salt or the uses or functions of salt. He is focusing on the intrinsic quality of salt, which is what the disciples are and must be. So the disciples, as disciples of Jesus, have to be salty within themselves, which means that if a person professes to be a disciple of Jesus, if a person professes to be a follower of Jesus, that person has to be Christ-like. That person has to be an alter Christus. That person has to behave like Jesus behaved. That person has to act like Jesus acted. The person has to reach out like Jesus did. In the first reading of today, Isaiah is so beautifully telling those who will listen to him and the whole community that they cannot merely be people who speak God's praises. They cannot be merely people who sing God's praises. They have to be people who will show their faith, who will show that they are God's chosen ones in action. When they reach out to a miserable person, when they reach out to the poor, when they stop being cheaters and thieves, when they stop taking advantage and being oppressors, that is the time they become light. That is the time when even in the night they will shine. That is the time when the shadows will not be shadows any longer, because they have lived out their faith in action. In the second metaphor that Jesus uses, he invites his disciples to be light of the world. And he speaks about the light which the disciples are. And the intrinsic quality of light, not merely that it lightens up the room or that it brightens up the room. The intrinsic quality of light is light. And that is what Jesus wants his disciples to be, just like he was. And he goes on to explain further this metaphor when he speaks about the disciples as a city which is built on a hill. The city built on a hill can be seen from far away. A lamp is brought into a room not to be hidden under the bed, not to be hidden under a bushel, but a lamp is brought into the room to be placed on a lampstand. The place of the light is the lampstand. The city built on a hill is one which cannot be hid. So when Jesus speaks about his disciples as the light of the world, he is asking and inviting his disciples to be like he did. To be that light which people will recognize as a light of hope. To be that light which people will recognize as a light to be imitated. To be that light which people will recognize as the light of God himself. And this light, Paul tells us in the second reading of today, when he says that he came to people not with lofty words, not with wisdom, not with eloquence. He came to people with one proclamation, and that is the proclamation of Jesus Christ and him crucified. The Lord, who invites his disciples to be both salt and light, is a disciple, is a man who led himself to the cross only because if that was the way he could save, if that was the way he could be salt and light, he would want that way and no other. It was not easy for Jesus to let go of his Godhead. It was not easy for Jesus to let go of the fact that he was one of the three divine persons. It was not easy for Jesus to become not merely as a human, but to go even further to accepting death on a cross, as Paul tells us. But he did that. And in doing so, he was the salt. He was the light. It is the same Jesus who invites us today to also be salt, never to lose our saltiness, never to lose our Christ-like nature, never to lose our nature of reaching out like Jesus did, and to be light of the world, so that people looking at us, people encountering us, must ask about us. Who are you that you do these things, and that you do them in this way? They must ask about our identity. They must ask about the kind of work that we do, the kind of actions that we perform. And they must see in those actions the selflessness which Jesus has shown us. How will you, as a disciple of Jesus, be both salt and light to everyone you meet today?